Hello, this is Michael Tracy, and this video is going to cover the various problems with the assessment of Mallory and Irvine's climb found in the book The Lost Explorer by Conrad Anker and David Roberts. I include both Anker and Roberts in this critical review because their book is clearly written by two different people and frequently ends up contradicting itself. Some of the claims it advances are so ridiculous, I find it difficult to believe that anyone who climbed Mount Everest would ever say them. This review is not a criticism of Conrad Anker or David Roberts themselves. I do not know either of these individuals, but Conrad Anker has had a very impressive but tragic climbing career. Given the amount of personal tragedy he has seen throughout his career, if he never wants to talk about mountain climbing or Mount Everest ever again, I would understand that. However, his book remains a major source for people interested in the 1924 expedition, and this video explains that not only is Anker and Roberts' assessment wrong, it is so wrong that it is difficult to ascribe the errors to simple differences of opinion or honest mistakes. First, a high-level overview of the Anker-Roberts assessment. They claim Mallory and Irvine left high camp extremely late and without any water. They were spotted by Odell at 12:50 climbing the first step via the Kangshung face, proceeded on until the second step, at which point they turned around at about 2 p.m. in a so-called storm. It then takes them more than 5 hours to get back to the ice axe location, and it is now nighttime. Mallory takes off both his gloves and fingerless mittens and tries to down-climb the rock with his bare hands when he falls. Then there's a different account where it is not actually the ice axe location, but rather the location 400 feet above where the body was found, with no explanation for how the ice axe got hundreds of feet above that. If none of this makes sense, don't worry. The rest of the video will explain exactly why none of it makes any sense. Starting with the night before, Anker has the cooker from Camp 6 roll down the hill, which prevents them from heating water. Anker spends a whole page on this with some story of him heating water between his legs on Annapurna. Anker concludes the pair would have been severely dehydrated because they could not have melted water. The only problem is that the cooker did not roll down from Camp 6. It rolled down from Camp 5. Here is the letter Mallory wrote to Odell. We're awfully sorry to have left things in such a mess. Our Una cooker rolled down the slope at the last moment. Be sure of getting back to 4 tomorrow in time to evacuate before dark as I hoped to. In the tent I must have left a compass. For the Lord's sake, rescue it. We are without. To here on 90 atmospheres for 2 days, so we'll probably go on 2 cylinders, but it's a bloody load for climbing. Perfect weather for the job. Although it appears to leave the matter fairly clear, Odell explicitly states it rolled down from 5. Soon after my arrival, Mallory's 4 porters arrived from 6, bringing me a message which said they had used but little oxygen to 27,000 feet, and that the weather promised to be perfect for the morrow's climb, and that he was sorry the cooking stove had rolled down the mountainside just as they were leaving Camp 5, which meant a cold supper and breakfast for me. Other accounts, such as The Wildest Dream, the book, have no problem understanding that the cooker rolled down from Camp 5. And yet here is Conrad Anker, over a decade later, still peddling the same misinformation about the cooker.
And Sandy Irvine was his climbing partner on that day. He was incredibly dehydrated. He had sunburned. As you saw, he was of fair complexion. They didn't have sunblock in the way that we have now. We didn't sun protection. And so he was terribly sunburned. His lips were peeling. He was parched. They didn't hydrate to the same standards that we do now. They lost their stove the night before. Their Una cooker rolled out. So everything wasn't in the cards for them. And they set out.
Curiously, with that video, it is Wade Davis who prompts Anker for the missing cooker bit. Prior to this, Davis had been extremely critical of the 1999 team's handling of the search for Mallory. In his book, Into the Silence, Davis relies exclusively on Anker's analysis and thus makes the exact same mistakes. Anker and Davis are both associated with National Geographic, and the video shows how one expert can be used to back up another expert and then confirm a theory that is clearly false. I'm working on a review of Into the Silence that is very favorable to the larger story Davis is trying to tell about the British Empire. I view his comments here as something he's required to say as part of his relationship with National Geographic, as some very basic fact-checking would show they were able to heat water in Camp 6. More problematic is that even if Anker was correct about the cooker rolling down from Camp 6, his analysis of what that would have meant is wrong. Odell was climbing in support. The purpose of support was to fill in if a climber was injured, to offer assistance, and to, quote, produce vital stimulants, hot tea or merely water, at the critical moment. Had the cooker indeed rolled down from Camp 6, the note to Odell would not be informing him of this, it would be directing him somehow to fix it. Odell would have had to either bring the cooker up immediately or rest and start early the next morning to get it to Mallory 2 hours prior to his intended start time. Mallory could have pushed the start time back to, say, 6 a.m. and told Odell to be there by 4 a.m. with the cooker. That was the primary purpose for Odell being there. Anker then goes on about how Irvine was sunburned and dehydrated because of the missing cooker that wasn't really missing. Even assuming Irvine was in some sort of bad shape, this again only highlights the reason Odell was climbing in support. If Irvine was sunburned or coughing or just couldn't adapt to the altitude, either he or Mallory would make the call to send him down and bring Odell up. Many climbers, realizing they are slowing their partner down, turn around so their partner can continue. Somerville had done just the same a couple days earlier, though he just sat down and waited for Norton to return. No doubt Irvine wanted to go to the summit, but if he felt he could not give it his full 100% effort, he would not want to be the one thing that prevented Mallory from doing so. This is a passage from Phil Urschler's book, Together on Top of the World, where he is describing his 1984 climb of Everest. They took a much lower traverse and climbed up the Norton Couloir and exited via the small gully where they had found the rope the Australian team had left on their descent. The Australians climbed out of the couloir much lower, and the various so-called maps on the internet that show the Australians exiting near the top of the couloir or out the small gully are incorrect. However, the Australians did descend via the small gully. Here, Phil Urschler and John Roskelley are having a conversation about turning around. John is having trouble and needs to abort the climb. I can't go on for another 3 hours and still make it back down. I looked at him sitting in the snow a little more than 1,000 feet from the top of the world. Despite my disappointment, I felt enormous respect for him. He was one of the best climbers in the world, daring, principled, independent, sometimes to the point of obstinacy, but he knew when to risk and when not to. Okay, I said, we're going down. What's this we shit? I don't need you to get down. I started to argue, but he interrupted me. Neither one of us was going to be able to live with himself or each other if you go down now, and we both know you could have made it. I looked away. I knew he was right, and that he was protecting himself as much as me. He didn't want to feel responsible for denying the summit to me and the team, so we unroped and shook hands. Then he went one way, and I went the other. That is the way real climbers do it. They both want success for the other person. Phil to see John successfully down the mountain, and John to see Phil make it to the summit. Both were willing to sacrifice to see that happen. Ultimately, it was more of a favor to John that Phil went on. No one wants to be the one that keeps their partner from the summit if they can get down safely on their own. If there was any problem with Irvine, they just would have agreed to send Irvine down and call up Odell. There was plenty of oxygen in high camp, and Mallory would just wait for Odell and start on the 9th. Or, if Odell was feeling strong, Irvine could arrive back down with the Sherpas and tell Odell to continue on to Camp 6. Odell is making about 800 feet per hour at this level, so although the climb to modern Camp 6 took Conrad Anker 6 hours using oxygen, Odell could do the just slightly shorter climb to the 1924 Camp 6 in about 2 hours without oxygen. These huge differences between Anker's times and the times of the 1924 expedition are covered in the Mallory versus Modern video. Mallory and Odell could then sleep on oxygen and start the next day at 6 a.m., and then I wouldn't have to listen to people complain about the choice of Irvine. But under no circumstances would Mallory head out with no water and Irvine struggling to keep up. Turning to the oxygen, Anker notes, it's possible they used oxygen to sleep, but I'd guess they saved it for the climb. Without oxygen, it's difficult to sleep at that altitude. You develop a cyclic breathing pattern, fast and shallow breaths alternating with no breaths at all, which wakes you up again and again. It's an automatic reaction of the body to lack of oxygen, so I'd guess they went to bed early and just tossed and turned most of the night. While he does state this is nothing more than his guess, there's ample evidence to see they likely slept with oxygen. They had at least 9 bottles at high camp. 2 had been used in the climb, leaving 7. As it would be too difficult to take all 7 on the climb, that would have one person carrying 4 bottles, it would make sense to use at least 1 bottle to sleep on. They could use a T-joint to breathe off the same bottle. However, Odell noted seeing bottles inside the tent. The only reason to leave a bottle in the tent is if you were sleeping with them. The tent is too small, and if you were not using the oxygen to sleep on, you would not have the bottle in the tent. Finch had used oxygen to sleep in 1922, so there was no reason to believe that Mallory would not do the same. Using 2 bottles to sleep on leaves 5 full bottles for the climb, which happens to match with the 5 bottles written on the note found in Mallory's pocket. Anker then has them set out after sunrise, although he does not bother to specify exactly when that would be. The issues of time zones has always been problematic, and I've finally worked it out. I'll get into the details of how we know what time sunrise was in the watch video. For now, I will simply give it as sunrise was 5:13 a.m. and sunset was 7:08 p.m. Anker then puts them at the first step where they are seen by Odell. The first step was very exposed 4th class climbing. If it had been any harder, we would have roped up and belayed, referring to him and Dave Hahn. Mallory could have done it. I doubt that he and Irvine would have gone up where the ropes go today. More likely, they would have climbed the step on the left-hand side of the ridge, closer to the Kangshung face. This may be the place where they were when Noel Odell caught his famous glimpse of them outlined against the sky. That statement is so bizarre, it needs to be broken down piece by piece. It is from a portion of the book where Anker is describing his own climb of the first step. I'm assuming Anker wrote this part as it is dealing with his personal experience dealing with the first step. However, in a different portion of the book, someone writes, "We know that Mallory and Irvine were roped together. At the time, a common practice on moderate mixed ground was to travel roped together with a second man carrying the coils. It turns out to be an incredibly dangerous practice. The very chore of managing the rope and maintaining a steady distance between climbers can cause accidents, and the chance of one man's belaying and stopping the other's fall is slim at best. Yet as late as the 1960s, mountaineers were still teaching this technique. Neither Dave Hahn nor Conrad Anker are old enough to have learned to rope up and belay in the 60s, so it is not clear what this is referring to. Modern climbers rope up when the need arises, and certainly roping up had both saved Mallory's life, and he had been holding the rope when he saved others, as I described in the Odell's View video. The passage I read previously by Phil Ursler shows that Phil and John were climbing roped up in 1984, so I'm not sure where Roberts gets the notion that people do not rope up on Everest. Turning to them climbing up the left-hand side of the ridge closer to the Kangshung face, just looking at what it would take to climb up the left side of the ridge shows it is impossible. In addition, Mallory said both the east face and the northeast ridge were alike impossible, and yet here Anker has them climbing both. Beyond the impossibility of Mallory climbing such a route, there is the problem that it would have them climbing up to the top of the left-hand side of the ridge. Unless Odell had X-ray vision, there would be no way he could see them until they were at the very top, and that does not match with Odell's sighting. Most likely this passage was a mistake, and he meant the left-hand side of the step, looking up at it from below, which would also be a bizarre route that the 1933 team looked at and easily determined you could bypass by simply walking around the step, the same way the Chinese did in 1960. However, the authors note, but Mallory had believed all along in an attack along the crest of the ridge, that was his style of climbing. It is not clear where this myth originated that Mallory preferred to climb ridges. It appears to have been simply invented by one of the so-called historians in order to fit their theory that Mallory climbed the ridge. However, Mallory was rather famous in his time as far as mountain climbers go, though not as famous as Achille Ratti, who would go on to become Pope and take an interest in the rock samples collected by the Mount Everest expeditions. Mallory's biographer, David Pye, was a friend and climbing partner of Mallory and wrote that Mallory preferred the Great Walls. He was always drawn to the big and unexplored. The Great Walls the mountaineers, as a rule, set aside as obviously impossible. The southeast face of the Matterhorn, the south face of Mont Blanc, between the Brouillard Ridge and the Aiguille Blanche de Portray, and the large eastern cliffs of Mont Blanc between the Portray Ridge and the Col de Brunva. Over all these, his climbing fancy brooded, year after year, questioning, speculating, pondering the possibilities. Although Mallory, like all mountain climbers, would occasionally climb ridges, there is nothing to indicate he was a ridge climber, and his close friend says he was a big wall climber, though big walls today are a little bigger than they were back then. Pye notes that Mallory's last climb in the Alps in 1920, prior to leaving for Everest in 1921, was an attempt up the south face of Mont Blanc. Thunderstorms forced the pair to turn around. Pye writes, "For we had gone to the Gamba for that purpose, but the weather never allowed us to get higher than the top of the Inominata and to plan our prospective bivouac and route on the vast wall above." So Mallory's style was definitely not ridge climbing. Getting back to the first step, there was the problem with Odell seeing the pair at the first step at 12:50. Anker and Roberts did not pin down the time of departure, but any reasonable time does not work for a 12:50 sighting at the first step. E.F. Norton knew this, which is why he initially moved both the location to the first step and the time back to 11 a.m. It took the 1933 team 3 hours to climb from the 1924 Camp 6 up to the first step without oxygen. Nowhere does Anker say how long it took him to get to the first step, and even looking in Ghost of Everest, the times given are 2:30 a.m. for leaving Camp 6, 6 a.m. for the top of the exit cracks, and 10 a.m. for Mushroom Rock. From this, you can make out probably 9 a.m. to be at the base of the first step. This means that Anker makes the shorter climb from modern Camp 6 to the first step in 6.5 hours with oxygen, fixed ropes, and a known route. The 1933 team does the longer route in less than half the time without oxygen, no ropes, and an unknown route. Some of these differences are covered in the Mallory versus modern video, but the extremely slow modern times seem to be limited to Conrad Anker. For instance, Dave Hahn, who was also climbing with Anker in 1999, went back in 2001 and makes the climb from modern Camp 6 to Mushroom Rock in 3 hours and 45 minutes, and no explanation is given as to why it took Anker and Hahn 7.5 hours to do the exact same climb 2 years earlier. Anker's bizarrely slow climb times make any comparison to Mallory impossible. There is no way Mallory would leave high camp at 9 a.m., take 4 hours to get to the top of the first step, and then not simply turn around. At that point, there would have been no possibility of making the summit. But if they turned around anywhere near there, it is difficult to see how they would fall from the ice axe location after only having been out 6 or 7 hours and having plenty of oxygen, water, and the weather was extremely warm, much warmer than when Norton and Somerville covered a substantially similar route just 50 meters lower. Anker solves this by making it nighttime when they fall, meaning it took them at least 5 hours to descend from someplace above the first step to the ice axe location. As I will get into it with the watch video, as soon as you start placing times on events, many of the more popular theories are easily seen to not be realistic. Anker and Roberts make a big deal about it being dark and how this would have caused them all sorts of problems. And yet, if you read Anker's account of descending in 1999, he and Dave Hahn are very late, and although they have a much superior, brighter headlamps, Anker writes the following. We got off rappel at the foot of the first step just at dusk. Now we were on easy terrain. Rather than take a break to put on our headlamps, I said, Dave, let's go. Let's really make time. This again shows the book was written by two different people that apparently did not even read what the other wrote. If Anker would forego a headlamp to save time, it is not clear why Mallory would not do the exact same thing. In any case, for Anker and Hahn, it was dark and they were descending across the ice axe area, and they chose not to use headlamps. It should also be noticed that the bottom of the first step marks the top of the yellow band, and when Anker and Hahn needed to descend it at night, with Hahn struggling, it is, quote, easy terrain, and yet the yellow band is trying difficult terrain when Mallory and Irvine are trying to climb it. But perhaps Anker and Hahn had better moonlight than Mallory. Nope, that is also not the case. Moonset was 9:01 p.m. on May 17, 1999, so they had a couple hours of a 7% moon compared to a 31% moon for Mallory and Irvine that would not set until after 11 p.m. And this brings us to the second step, for which Anker and Roberts write, all of these considerations add up to a strong case in my mind that Mallory and Irvine did not summit on June 8, 1924, but the clincher for me is the second step. They go on for several pages describing how impossible it would be for Mallory to climb the second step. However, one might wonder if there might be a different opinion about how difficult the second step really is. It turns out yes, and that opinion comes from Conrad Anker himself. Immediately after Conrad Anker climbed the second step, Eric Simonson called him up over the radio and asked if he thought Mallory could have done it. The following is from Mark Sinnott's The Third Pole. Cameras were rolling in ABC when Anker radioed Simonson a few minutes later. It was a made-for-TV moment. Could Mallory have scaled the head wall? Asked Simonson. Anker said yes, it was possible. He reckoned the second tier was a climb of intermediate difficulty by modern standards, a grade we know Mallory routinely climbed in his Peak District stomping ground. And while Anker later changed his mind about this, he never mentions his initial assessment in the book. Nor does he provide any explanation as to why he was able to climb the head wall of the second step in just 5 minutes, but this would somehow be impossible for Mallory in any amount of time. The one piece of analysis that Anker and Roberts get correct is about the descent of the second step. They conclude that it would not be possible without leaving a rope in place. Surprisingly, this analysis is detailed, and while it does exaggerate the length of the rope that would be needed to be left in place, the basic premise that descending the second step would be at least as difficult, if not more difficult, than the ascent is valid. Some so-called researchers even now claim that Mallory and Irvine climbed the ridge and possibly made it up the second step. One problem with these theories is that they never explain exactly how Mallory and Irvine would have made it back down. So Anker and Roberts have them turning around at the second step, returning late at night, and then coming to the fall location. Anker notes that Mallory's body was found without any gloves on and with a spare pair of fingerless gloves in his pockets. Since May 1, I've thought a lot about Mallory's hands. Why wasn't he wearing gloves? He had the spare pair of fingerless knit gloves in his pocket, but they looked as though they had never been used. The other thing that struck me at once is that his hands showed no signs of frostbite. The logical reason Mallory's body was found without any gloves on was that they fell off as he was falling the over 1,000 feet down the side of the mountain, grasping at the snow and rock to arrest his fall. However, Anker and Roberts reasoned it was more likely Mallory removed them so he could downclimb some difficult obstacle on his route using nothing but his bare hands. This is nonsense, but the interesting thing is how much time Anker and Roberts spends talking about the gloves and his hands without catching a rather obvious problem. Anker reported finding a spare pair of gloves in Mallory's pockets and noting they looked like they were never used. However, only one glove was photographed down in base camp, and only one glove was turned over to the Royal Geographic Society. Had Anker found just a single glove in Mallory's pocket, it would have immediately hit him that something went wrong and Mallory had to replace a glove for some reason. However, he didn't note anything amiss because he found the spare pair that Mallory had taken with him, as many climbers do. Someone on the expedition, the 1999 expedition, later pilfered one of them. They all know it, and everyone is keeping silent about it. I don't think it was any of the climbers that took it, but there are other people that had access to those items. Of course, there is a video of the find, which would clear up whether there were indeed 2 gloves initially found, but that video will never be released. And this brings us to the actual fall, where the account switches between them falling from the ice axe or falling from someplace lower down. The notion that Mallory fell from someplace lower down is based on some pseudoscientific analysis that because Anker observed 2 other bodies that were, quote, broken up, which had presumably fallen from the ridge, and Mallory's body was not broken up, then Mallory could not have fallen from the ridge. The main problem with this is that other bodies are broken up that fall only a few feet. This can be seen with Namgyal Sherpa, who was an 11 times Everest summiter, but only made it back 10 times. He died of a heart attack while descending at the top of the exit cracks in 2013. As he had just died a couple days earlier, when I saw the body in 2013, it was fully intact. When I went back in 2018, his body had moved down about 5 meters and was broken up and contorted. It was very disturbing to see. I will not put the photos of this, but for the morbidly obsessed, you can see his body in the Ghost Above video. Bodies break up when they are frozen, and then they fall further down the mountain, even if only a short distance. It is not difficult to see what happened to Namgyal. He died in 2013, and he was still attached to the fixed ropes when I passed a couple days later. In 2018, he was no longer on the fixed ropes, but was further down the mountain and was broken up. The only thing Mallory's body not being broken up proves is that he was not attached to fixed ropes when he died. I will also leave it with the still frame from Wings of Everest, which I have marked with the ice axe location and Mallory's body. Simple physics show that it would not be possible for Mallory to have fell a short distance. This has to do with basic high school physics, acceleration, deceleration, and coefficients of friction. I leave it as an exercise to the viewer to explain why Anker and Roberts' belief he fell a short distance does not match up with the laws of physics. In any case, Anker and Roberts never explain how the ice axe would have been left there had they fallen from further down the mountain, nor why Mallory and Irvine would have timed their fall so that it just happened to line up with the ice axe location. For those curious, this is marking the potential location of Irvine, which matches the final resting place video. I've been asking for photos of this location for years, and I have numerous photos from 2018 with it covered in snow. 2 teams were there in 2019, and not a single high-resolution photo of this area has been released. Ultimately, The Lost Explorer presents a sloppily researched account that has so many factual inaccuracies that it says more about the people writing it than about Mallory and Irvine's actual climb. As people have complained that my videos don't have enough humor, I'll end with a humorous slide, and you can look forward to at least one joke in the upcoming video about George Mallory's watch.